Father Annibale Bugnini has been called rightly the father of the Novus Ordo. He helped advocate for the end of ad orientem worship and many of the traditions of the traditional Latin Mass. He pushed for communion in the hand. He even advocated for Hindu scriptures to be permitted in the liturgy of the Word in Masses said in India. When the Novus Ordo first began being drafted, Bugnini told Pope Paul VI, quote, "Holy Father, the reform will continue as long as your holiness retains this confidence in me. As soon as it lessens, the reform will come to a halt." Truly, these were prophetic words which are recorded in Bugnini's own Reform of the Liturgy. In this video, we will be discussing the fall of Annibale Bugnini, how Pope Paul VI ultimately did come to lose his confidence in the father of the Novus Ordo. So, let's get started. Lest any of us see this video as an opportunity to sort of dunk on the sins of somebody else that we're talking about, some of these historical subjects, let's all repent of our own sins. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, I confess to Almighty God, to Blessed Mary Ever Virgin, to Blessed Michael the Archangel, to Blessed John the Baptist, to the holy apostles Peter and Paul, and to all the saints, that I have sinned exceedingly in thought, word, and deed, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. Therefore, I beseech Blessed Mary Ever Virgin, Blessed Michael the Archangel, Blessed John the Baptist, the holy apostles Peter and Paul, and all the saints to pray to the Lord our God for me. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Consider liking the video, sharing, all that good stuff. Do comment as you watch if you have any observations, if you think I've missed the mark. Also consider joining the Scholarium Matris Dolorosae, joining a community of Catholic scholars faithful to tradition, and also gain access to the Fundamentals of Theology program. Last plug, consider shopping for some awesome, cool merchandise from the channel. There's a link in the description. So let's begin. In our previous study, we examined the full flowering of modernism, the manner in which so many Catholic writers and pastors sort of took the liturgical reform into their own hands during the 1970s and began to practice and suggest illicit adaptations of the Mass that went well beyond the 1969 Novus Ordo Missal. Besides simply being distasteful, many of these adaptations were born of liturgical heresies, and we covered that in depth in the previous video. There were, in fact, liturgical trade books and articles being written during the 70s that explicitly denied liturgical dogmas that had been proclaimed during the 22nd session of the Council of Trent. There were also, of course, many other errors being widely spread throughout the 1970s. We didn't really dive into the doctrinal heresies which were rampant and were being proclaimed at times, tragically, in Catholic schools, in Catholic seminaries even, and from the pulpits. There was a lot of confusion during the 1970s because so many pastors had in fact embraced what Pope Pius X had previously called modernism. For these progressive Catholics, the Novus Ordo seemed to be a good start, but it was, like the 1965 reforms of the document Inter Oecumenicae, deemed to be merely transitional. Many of these reforms could be said to be offensive to pious ears. Many of these illicit reforms, that is, could be said to be offensive to pious ears, those that were taken on by ordinary parish priests that were trying to take the reform beyond the reform of 1969. In his article, Good Things Don't Just Happen, Father Michael Moynihan, a Jesuit, encouraged pastors to use non-scriptural readings, such as excerpts from popular novels, poems, short stories, essays, or plays, during the liturgy of the Word to help communicate the pastor's message, because he and many other like-minded pastors believed that these non-scriptural texts could communicate the message, whatever that meant, just as good as the Bible could, indicating either they had a sense that divine revelation could occur just as much through novels as it could through the Bible, or that the Bible was not in fact the infallible Word of God at all, making it equal with other fallible texts, which is the sense you get whenever you read historical critical method commentaries on the sacred scriptures, which seem to shed all kinds of doubt on the infallibility of Holy Writ. We also reviewed so-called clown masses, football masses, Renaissance and revel masses, and more. The general dissatisfaction with the Novus Ordo indicated that many overvalued the importance of the cultural relevance of the Mass, which does have a role. The Mass should respond to the culture of the participants of the liturgy in some manner. If that were not the case, there would be no tradition of culturally distinct rites. But when we place the cultural responsiveness of the liturgy at the very center of the liturgy, we do in fact have a liturgy that is oriented toward man, rather than orienting man toward God. We must value that the Mass is a propitiatory sacrifice above all. That is the reason we are obliged to go to it, because true worship is in fact sacrifice, and perfect worship is perfect sacrifice. The only perfect sacrifice is that of Jesus Christ laying down his life on the cross. We are obligated to attend Mass on Sunday because if we truly love God, we will desire to offer him true worship, perfect worship, and we have that ability by simply attending Mass. Attending Mass is the ability to offer ourselves along with the offering of the priest and offer God a truly perfect sacrifice. But if we do not believe the Mass is even a perfect sacrifice or a sacrifice at all, there's no point in attending, and since that sense of the Mass being the perfect sacrifice presented on the altar, since that sense has been lost amongst the faithful, so too has Mass attendance. Some explicitly denied the Mass's nature as a sacrifice, though most progressive writers would not go quite this far. Father Warren Roos, OFM, said in an article which obtained a nihil obstat from a bishop that, quote, a fact historically past cannot be actualized anew, mystically or in the sacrament, even by God himself. And this quote explicitly denies the dogma forbidding this proposition, which was proclaimed in the 22nd session of Trent. While perhaps not going as far as many of these liturgists, perhaps because he knew he couldn't, or else he would lose his position of prominence, or perhaps because he didn't hold this radical of heretical positions, Bugnini and his associates in the Concilium, which would be merged with the Congregation of Sacred Rites in 1969 to form the Congregation of Divine Worship, spent the first half of the 1970s continuing their efforts to enculturate the liturgy in each nation. They too seem to have seen the Novus Ordo as merely a transitional phrase. In this video, we examine how this last phase of the liturgical movement ultimately failed, however, granting us today a stable Roman Missal. In other words, we will be looking at how Bugnini's efforts to further the reform beyond the 1969 Novus Ordo were ultimately put to an end by Pope Paul VI. It was simply the reform that wouldn't stop. In this video, we will be concluding our examination of the Novus Ordo reform, which, to the displeasure of St. Paul VI, it seems, continued, even out of his control, well into the 1970s. There will be one more video after this where we'll talk about the origins of the trad movement, the traditionalist movement in response to the Novus Ordo. In the wake of Humanae Vitae, promulgated in 1968, Pope Paul VI faced an international episcopate that had shown itself to be quite comfortable rebelling against his decisions if they deemed them to be too conservative. In Canada, the Canadian Bishops' Conference was the first to issue a statement asserting that Catholics in Canada who sincerely attempted but failed to follow the encyclical Humanae Vitae, if they believed it was right for them to use contraceptives in their heart, they could do so in good conscience. The bishops of the Netherlands, of France, of Germany, of Belgium, of Indonesia. Now, the hierarchy of Indonesia at this time was comprised mostly of Dutch, or from the Netherlands, so that explains why Indonesia jumped in the rebellion, and Scandinavia did as well. So all these nations, a huge number of nations, officially dissented. Their National Bishops' Conference issued statements of dissent, basically telling Catholics in their nations, the moral principles of Humanae Vitae do not apply to us. You are allowed to use contraceptives, in our opinion, if you believe in your heart it's right. In essence, a schism was just beneath the surface, cracking the unity of the Catholic Church in all of these prominent nations. For Indonesia, which wasn't prominent exactly, but that was just a reflection of the Dutch hierarchy's radical progressivism. The notion that we only must obey Rome when we agree with Rome is in fact a rejection of Rome's juridical authority, which is the definition of a schism. When you believe you are not obligated to accept Rome's decisions, you're stating Rome doesn't have authority over you, and that's the definition of a schism. What was the proper response? If Pope Paul VI would have simply come down with the hammer on all of these nations, this might have caused the schism to rupture the church of these nations completely, just as St. Pius V's hammer seemed to cause a permanent schism in England in the 16th century. Now, I'm not at all one to criticize St. Pius V. He's one of my favorite saints. But, ultimately, he did come down extremely hard on Queen Elizabeth. And of course you could say this is not maybe apples to apples. Maybe you could say Queen Elizabeth was embracing Calvinism, and that's clearly a distinct theological system. Well, you might argue that a lot of these bishops, especially the bishops of the Netherlands, were embracing a theological system which was likewise very incompatible with Catholic orthodoxy. So when Pope Pius V outright condemns and actually he declares that no one is obligated to be loyal to Queen Elizabeth, he even helped try to fund a rebellion against her, perhaps those actions did lead the Church of England to further, separate itself from the Catholic Church and from Rome. Maybe that contributed to the enduring nature of the Anglican Schism, which ultimately became an outright Anglican heresy. Now, we have a different response towards this sort of a nationalistic church in the 17th and 18th century, when this becomes a popular form of ecclesiology in nations like Austria and different parts of Germany, and also in especially France, where the Gallican ecclesiastical schismatic heresy took hold. Rome had more of a soft approach towards these ecclesiologies, which seemed to be more schismatic, and sort of just waited until hopefully these nations would come back around. And ultimately the hierarchy of Austria and France did come back around, and so we didn't end up with a permanent Gallican church as we have a permanent Anglican church. So maybe the soft approach actually was the right response to a nationalistic heresy like Anglicanism. Anyways, Pope Paul VI had to decide, what am I going to do here? He's basically confronted with national hierarchies which are doing similar schismatic actions to the Gallican schism, quasi-schism in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then Anglicanism in the 16th century. Ultimately, he decides, you know what, I won't come down with the hammer against these bishops that refuse to obey me. I'm going to try to have more of a soft approach towards them and try to smooth things over with them. But this would severely limit how much he could exercise his authority, because he was implicitly accepting the situation in which large numbers of bishops throughout the world would simply not obey him if they disagreed with him. This is a very difficult situation to pontificate over. Did he have the right response or not? That's definitely up for debate, but that is the angle that he took, was to imitate more of the popes of the 18th century in their response to Gallicanism than, Pius V's hammer that he brought down on Anglicanism. In many cases, Paul VI's response to the sort of schismatic attitude from all these different national bishops' conferences would have a marked effect on how he oversaw the continued reform beyond the reform in the 1970s, because a great deal of these bishops' conferences made it known to the Vatican that they wanted further reform, such as communion in the hand, or more anaphoras, or the elimination of minor orders. And when he basically delayed responding to their requests, a lot of these bishops would just start doing these things all on their own, and ultimately Pope Paul VI would continually relent to these actions, which really were liturgical rebellions on the part of pastors and even bishops. Now, was the SSPX treated unequally? Why didn't the SSPX get more of a soft, conciliatory approach like these renegade bishops' conferences did? Pacification certainly was not the policy of Pope Paul VI toward the SSPX, which sort of held a similar ecclesiastical position to these national bishops' conferences. Both the Canadian bishops as well as the SSPX held the position that they would obey the magisterium when they agreed with them, which in essence says, you don't really have authority over us, we're going to do what we want. Of course, the SSPX is not equal in merit to disobedient bishops' conferences who rebelled against Humanae Vitae. These bishops' conferences were disobeying the Pope and Catholic traditional doctrinal orthodoxy, while the SSPX was disobeying the Pope, or being willing to disobey the Pope, in favor of what was clearly traditional doctrinal orthodoxy, which is a greater good than doctrinal heresy, dissenting on whether or not isolated developments found in the Vatican II reform, especially church teachings regarding religious liberties and the implementation of the Novus Ordo, were consistent with Catholic tradition. Of course, the SSPX would phrase these disagreements in inflammatory ways, even accusing Pope Paul VI of compromising with modernism, which is not going to get Paul VI to look very favorably upon the SSPX. So, to be clear, the SSPX did not exactly take a conciliatory approach toward their relationship with the Vatican. After the 1975 declaration of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, which condemned Pope Paul VI's post-Vatican II direction for the Church, the Vatican asked his local bishop to suppress his society, which he did, but Lefebvre ignored the suppression of the SSPX. Once again, an implicit rejection of the authority of the Pope, saying, I will do what you want as long as I agree with you, I won't do what you want if I don't agree with you. He went on to ordain priests illicitly the next year. When Pope Paul VI explicitly accused him of disobedience and rebellion, Lefebvre responded by accusing Pope Paul VI once again of engaging and compromising with modernism. And that was the end of that relationship. We will examine more about the SSPX question in the next video on the origins of the traditionalist movement. If you feel I'm oversimplifying the issue here, or if you have insights on this very important historical topic, let me know in the comments. But regardless, the reason that the SSPX was persecuted and dissident bishops' conferences were not has a few possible answers. Perhaps Pope Paul VI either saw himself more allied with progressive bishops than traditionalist Lefebvre and his seminarians, and thus was more likely to give a favorable treatment to the progressives. That's typically how the unequal treatment is analyzed, is that Pope Paul VI just liked the progressives more than he liked Lefebvre. In my opinion, the more likely reason for this unequal treatment is that Paul VI believed the SSPX would be easier to suppress because it was much smaller than it would be to suppress an entire national bishops' hierarchy. I suspect that if Pope Paul VI could bring down the hammer on national bishops' conferences without them simply becoming further entrenched in their errors and even perhaps inflaming a lasting centuries-long schism, I think he very likely would have considered that option, but he saw it as not an option because he didn't want to deal with the negative effects or consequences of this sort of hammer treatment of these dissident bishops. Of course, with time, ultimately the Vatican could appoint new bishops. He was in charge of the cardinals. He could choose cardinals who could hopefully appoint new bishops who would not dissent. And so with time, dissident hierarchies can be reformed simply by the death of bishops. However, the existence of a society such as SSPX could not be reformed simply with time, because this society by its very constitution does not take on papal appointments, and so there was no ability to just simply replace the leaders of SSPX over time, since they did not obey the Pope when they disagreed, at least. This is a little bit more background on the origins of SSPX. That'll all go out in the next video. But in general, I do think there are serious problems that have to be considered about simply waiting for heresy to die out. In my own Diocese of Detroit, Vatican II, the implementation of the reforms of Vatican II was amongst the most progressive implementations of the reforms that we saw in all of North America. So you have a lot of parishes, especially in the city of Detroit, where all kinds of strange things are still happening to the present day. The problem with the approach to these, frankly, dissident, rebellious, and modernist liturgical practices, the problem with the approach of simply waiting for the pastors of these churches to retire and then replacing them with good pastors is that, first of all, that's a lot to put on the shoulders of a young, new priest. To go into a parish that's been engaging with liturgical heresy and doctrinal errors for decades, and then tell a 25-year-old to go in there and clean it up, you're of course going to have the parishioners not very happy about that. This happened at the Detroit Church of Holy Rosary, which had some issues. Ultimately, when the pastor ends up retiring, a good order is brought in to kind of clean things up at that parish, and it became such a scandal. It was on the front page of the Detroit Free Press about how just this denigration of this pastor who was a great man. He actually died very young, so rest in peace. But The front page of the Free Press was suggesting he was a racist because parishioners were calling him racist for unfounded reasons and real Catholic. So he taught the actual faith. He didn't teach the errors of modern academia from the pulpit. And after decades and decades of the opposite, I mean, that's really hard for someone to come in and clean that up, especially without, support. There are other parishes in my diocese, but also in dioceses throughout the country where, tents are set up, even perhaps with the parish name, at rainbow parades. And these are things that you can't just wait for these errors to die out. You have to be a pastor and you have to defend your flock, especially the children in these parishes. They deserve a real Catholic formation. And it's not good just to wait for the modernist pastors to retire. You have to actually correct and guide and even discipline all along the way. You can't just, even for their own souls, even for these, you can't just ignore. That's never a manly style of leadership in any area, is ignoring problems. So now, Pope Paul VI has been accused many times of simply ignoring the problems that were occurring throughout the Catholic Church throughout the 1970s. Now, was he ignoring them? I lean towards saying he wasn't ignoring them. I lean towards saying that he perceived that these problems would not have gone away if he asserted his authority anyways, and his approach was, I'm going to try to reconcile this giant body of rebellious pastors and bishops. Once again, I'm not saying that's the right approach, but I do think that was his attitude. I think that was the approach he was taking. Now, perhaps Pope Paul VI had created a sense during the Vatican II, the manner in which he oversaw the council, that he was in favor of a more democratic constitution to the Church. He did, in fact, not participate in Vatican II debates. He generally would watch these discussions happening from a television and would only intervene when absolutely necessary. So maybe he himself gave the impression that he was taking a step back from the juridical authority of the papacy. But even if he gave that sense, this was not his intention. There's no indication he did reject the supremacy of the papacy. And even if he did give this sense, this does not legitimize the rebellious behavior of so many bishops' conferences. It does, however, help us contextualize it. An examination of the post-1969 and even post-1967 changes to the Roman Rite liturgy indicate that Pope Paul VI was, in 1967, becoming very uncomfortable with the progression of the Novus Ordo reform, but seemed unconfident in himself in actually putting his foot down. He seemed to trust the scholars he had put in charge of the reform. We've talked all about that already in the series. And after 1969, he was especially uncomfortable with the changes that were still taking place after the Novus Ordo was promulgated, but ultimately he continued to relent to Bugnini and the Congregation of Divine Worship in each of the matters which he expressed discomfort. Of course, Pope Paul VI was quite pleased with the 1969 Missal itself. In an address given in March of 1965, he even described lay people who were concerned over the liturgical changes in favor of traditionalism as merely being, quote, confused or annoyed. He stated that complaints over the changes in the Mass, such as the reception of communion while standing rather than kneeling, or the suppression of the last Gospel and Leonine prayers, came only from people who had, quote, very little penetration into the meaning of the religious rites, end quote, and gave evidence, quote, not of true devotion and a true sense of the meaning and value of the Mass, but rather a certain spiritual laziness, end quote. So to review, Pope Paul VI insults traditionalists of the liturgy, calls them spiritually lazy, and says they do not have true devotion or a true sense of the meaning and value of the Holy Mass, because they're clinging to the traditional Latin Mass and haven't embraced fully the Novus Ordo. So that is perhaps the most unflattering quote I could give you from Pope Paul VI. That does not seem to be a very favorable way of talking about your flock. Simply has great devotion to the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of the Ages. In contrast, St. Paul VI once described a, quote, very moving, end quote, conversation had with lay people who had positive reactions to the reforms that, once again, he had overseen. He described one such person as being, quote, a very distinguished old gentleman of great heart and of a spirituality so deep as to never be fully satisfied, end quote. What greater praise could you get from the Pope? And the reason Pope Paul VI was so confident that he had such a great spirituality that could never be satisfied is because this old man was in favor of the Novus Ordo. This old man had told his priest, in the words of Pope Paul VI, quote, of his happiness at having finally taken part in the holy sacrifice to the full spiritual measure, perhaps for the first time in his life. End quote. All the same, while Pope Paul VI certainly had harsh words to say for traditionalists who rejected the Novus Ordo and had very high praise for those lay people who loved the Novus Ordo, he did in fact not seem pleased with the direction the reform was headed after 1970. All the same, he seemed to be uncertain about how to slow down the revolutionary alliance of liturgical writers, the Congregation of Divine Worship, which was a merger of the Congregation of Sacred Rites and the Concilium, rebellious bishops' conferences, and pastors willing to implement the reforms. As we will see, when he denied the request of the Congregation of Divine Worship, the CDW, on a given matter, all of a sudden, it would seem, requests for permission would just flood the offices of the CDW and then be forwarded to the Vatican Secretary of the State, applying pressure to Pope Paul VI to relent on whatever decision of the CDW that he had disagreed with. If Pope Paul VI put his foot down, open revolt would ensue, the requested changes would begin to simply take root on the ground level illicitly, until ultimately Pope Paul VI would relent, legitimizing the reform rather than dispense canonical penalties to the offenders. This video will conclude with the ultimate solution that Pope Paul VI found to this problem of this repeated legitimization of liturgical rebellions that seem to always agree with exactly what Bugnini had asked for but been denied. It seemed like every time Bugnini asked for something and got it denied, a revolution would ensue, the practice would take place anyways, and then Pope Paul VI would ultimately relent because he didn't really know what he could do to suppress dissident movements of bishops. Ultimately, he ends up dismissing Bugnini and sending him into exile in Iran. Did he, in fact, ultimately send Bugnini as an apostolic nuncio to Iran because he discovered that he was a Freemason? There's certainly a good deal of evidence or smoke to this rumor. We can't simply ignore it. We will discuss it thoroughly at the end of the video. But once again, it also is a plausible theory that Pope Paul VI simply dismissed Bugnini because of growing friction, which we can observe even within the pages of Bugnini's own Reform of the Liturgy. There is a growing friction between Pope Paul VI and Bugnini throughout the 1970s. If we want to look at what the sort of dissident national bishops' hierarchies looked like in the 1970s, Vatican II called for stronger national bishops' conferences, but these bishops' conferences began to be vehicles for dissent against Rome and dissent against Catholic tradition, relativizing church doctrine and moral teachings to the cultural need of a particular nation. So let's look at the Netherlands to begin. Okay, this is kind of ground zero for the modernist explosion we saw in the 1970s. The bishops of the Netherlands were amongst the leaders of what has been called the Rhine Group in the great Vatican II expose, The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, which is critical of this political maneuvering during Vatican II, but was not in fact written by a traditionalist, and it was written by a priest who ultimately accepted Vatican II and appreciated it. Later, after Vatican II, the Dutch hierarchy would promulgate the condemned Dutch Catechism, which was written in large part by Father Eduard Schillebeeckx, who was a top periti, or theological advisor, during Vatican II. The Dutch hierarchy then, in 1968, officially dissented from Humanae Vitae, as the Dutch Catechism already had. Before Humanae Vitae was even published, the Dutch hierarchy in their official Dutch Catechism, which is called New Catechism in English, stated that contraceptives are okay now. We've realized that they're actually okay, even though the Church has condemned contraceptives since the very first centuries. After the Novus Ordo was promulgated, numerous Dutch bishops began to write their own anaphoras. First of all, they were writing their own Eucharistic prayers before the Novus Ordo was even promulgated, so before 1969. Later, the Dutch priests would begin to illicitly institute communion in the hand, before this was illicit either. Jesus tells us, "You shall know them by their fruit," when speaking to prophets. And the fruit of this rebellious attitude in the Netherlands for the past 60 years is that only 2.7% of Dutch Catholics who still identify as Catholic, there are many Dutch that do not even identify that way anymore, but in 2023 or 22, a study was taken, and only 2.7% of Catholics in the Netherlands attend Mass weekly. We mentioned Father Warren Roos's denial that the Mass is a true sacrifice already. So we can just move on from that. Let's talk about the actions of the concilium in the 1970s. While pastors were instituting their own illicit reforms on the ground level, not least amongst the enthusiastic promoters of the new liturgy were the members of the Congregation of Divine Worship itself. Due to the liturgical movement's tendency to approach the liturgy as the subjective religious experience of a given community, the concilium did not consider their task finished with the promulgation of the Reformed Missal in 1969, but rather immediately following the promulgation of the New Order Mass, Monsignor Bugnini and the concilium attempted to publish a document which altered the rubrics of the Mass for celebrations with, quote, special groups. And if I say concilium, I really should be saying Congregation of Divine Worship. The CDW believes that such Masses, likely celebrated in private homes, should omit the sign of the cross. Why? It's unclear. Bugnini wanted the sign of the cross to be omitted from the Novus Ordo itself, but Pope Paul VI insisted that it be retained, and so it was. But for some reason, if Mass is being celebrated in a home, you shouldn't have the sign of the cross. Why? We don't know. It should contain only one reading. Why? Once again, we don't know. Should distribute communion under both kinds, even though that wasn't licit yet. Should allow the laity to share their reflections during the homily along with the priest, and should include, quote, other adaptations thought to be necessary. Characteristic vague language that's open to all manners of interpretations. Due to pushback from the Vatican Secretary of State, the ultimate instruction on Masses for special gatherings was much more conservative in nature than the CDW's original proposal. The final document did permit irregular Masses to be held in private residences, but required liturgical vestments and a faithful following of the Missal and the general instruction of the Roman Missal to be followed in alternative settings, just as it would be in a normal chapel. The concilium did later successfully promulgate the Directory for Masses with Children in order to subjectivize the Mass according to the perceived needs of demographic of congregants, of kids. Since children were perceived as incapable of appreciating the subtle gestures of the liturgy, the CDW proposed that the Mass be simplified to only emphasize three basic elements of the Mass, including the scripture readings, the Eucharistic prayer, and communion, and to get rid of everything else. So Bible, anaphora, communion, that's it. That's all the kids can handle. I'm a 5th grade teacher. I don't know if they are a 10-year-old child, but a 10-year-old child is capable of reading full novels, is capable of doing 6-digit divided by 3-digit long division problems. So the kind of standards we give to kids for reading and math and science and social studies, for whatever reason, so many people assume, but they're only capable of the same amount of religious instruction as a potato. So kids are capable of quite a bit, and of course, especially in religion, I think it's so important that we talk up to kids rather than talk down to kids, because when we talk down to them, we run the risk of making children feel that religion is beneath them. When we talk up to them, even if they're confused, they're going to gain the sense that religion is above them, and we want them to respect religion even if they're confused by it. We don't want them to disrespect simple tenets of a religion that they understand completely and find nothing substantial within it. But the idea of talking down to children that's what this Directory for Masses with Children was all about. And in general, I think that maybe a lot of would perhaps benefit from spending more time with actual kids. There tends to be an effort during Masses said with children to kind of aim for the youngest of the congregants, kind of aim for the kindergartners. Meanwhile, you might have 8th graders that are, it's not aimed at them, so they're obviously not as in touch. And I really think the kindergartners are going to enjoy being at Mass no matter what. The 8th graders, you should really try to challenge them. But, different priests have different approaches. While not all of the requests of the concilium for the Masses said with children were granted, the concilium did succeed in promoting the common practice which would be adopted in many American Catholic churches after 1970 of sending children under a certain age to another room during the liturgy of the Word, where they would simply color pictures or maybe hear someone tell them the Bible story or heard a simple explanation of the reading by a catechist, and then they would return to the liturgy of the Eucharist. The Children's Directory also led to the publication of a children's lectionary with alternative readings and a more easily understood translation than the one used in the official lectionary. Presently, the USCCB discourages priests from using the lectionary during Masses at Catholic schools, so that's good. 3 new Eucharistic prayers were eventually promulgated exclusively for Masses with children, which include various dialogue back-and-forth prayers between the priest and the lay children throughout the entire Eucharistic prayer. This was thought to enhance lay engagement with children congregants. Of course, that's not used very often in the Catholic school world as well, because once again, the sensus fidelium of the faith was more traditional, even in 99% of Novus Ordo parishes, than the concilium. And so this idea of having like special back and forth Eucharistic prayers between the kids and the priest is still licit. Those were promulgated in the early 1970s, but they're virtually unheard of in Catholic schools today. The enthusiastic supporters of the liturgical reform also successfully achieved the post-1969 change of extending formal permission to receive communion in the hand rather than on the tongue. By contrast, of course, traditional Catholicism only permitted lay communicants to receive the sacrament on the tongue in recognition of the dignity of both the Eucharist as well as the fear of seeing it drop to the ground. Progressive liturgists, however, began to unilaterally advocate for the reception of communion in the hands, since it was perceived as less childish. Advocacy for communion in the hand had begun, in fact, in the 1950s by liturgical movement writers, as we've talked about. Thus, at the encouragement of liturgists, pastors began to simply instruct their congregations to receive communion in the hand in the 1970s, even though this was forbidden. The illicit practice of receiving communion in the hand had really begun in 1968, at the ground level in the nations one might suspect: Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. As the practice seemed impossible to suppress, Paul VI granted permission for the practice in these nations. He also opened the door for granting permission for this practice in any other nations where communion in the hand had already spread to a point where it seems that it could not be suppressed. In other words, all you had to do to get communion in the hand, even though it wasn't allowed, was start having your lay people doing it, and then once your lay people were doing it, the Pope would allow it. As more bishops' conferences began to request this innovation, St. Paul VI asked the concilium to disseminate a survey amongst the world's bishops to acquire their opinions on the topics. Bugnini reported in his book that while 567 bishops were in favor of communion in the hand, 1,233 were opposed to it. As a result of these responses, Paul VI was emboldened to oversee the publication of Memoriale Domini in 1969, in which he affirmed that the traditional manner of receiving communion on the tongue was preferable, and he argued that the suppression of this practice would lead to a general profanation of the sacrament and a reduction in belief in transubstantiation. That document has, of course, never been repealed. Therefore, still to this day, the Church's magisterium asserts that communion on the tongue is preferable. In 1973, St. Paul VI asked the then Archbishop Bugnini to publish an article in the Vatican periodical L'Osservatore Romano that would support his decision, because he knew that many of the progressives looked to Bugnini as their leader rather than the Pope. So Pope Paul VI asked Bugnini to write him an article that would support his Memoriale Domini. However, Bugnini responded to this request by writing the exact opposite. The article he wrote for the L'Osservatore Romano explained rather why the reception of communion in the hand was easily perceived by anyone who looked at the matter calmly and without prejudice as, quote, reasonable, wise, prudent, and moderate, which was in the spirit of the council. As the liturgical movement continued to gain momentum throughout the 1970s, the sentiments of the international episcopate towards communion in the hand began to agree with Archbishop Bugnini rather than Pope Paul VI. This process was aided by Paul VI's consistent appointment of progressive bishops or reformist heavily leaning bishops to empty episcopal chairs in an attempt to prevent a traditionalist revolt against Vatican II. Ultimately, all of the bishops' conferences of the entire world except for Sri Lanka ultimately asked for permission for communion in the hand once progressive pastors had begun employing this practice illicitly. In the United States, the vote made by the National Bishops' Conference, the National Conference of Bishops in 1976, to request this indult was contentious to say the least. Many bishops in America argued that no prevailing custom had been established in the United States to warrant such a request. The initial vote to request communion in the hand did not receive the necessary two-thirds majority, but then a great deal of absentee ballots were collected under questionable circumstances. Sounds a little bit familiar. The desired number of yes votes was thus attained, and, of course, the Vatican granted approval for our nation to begin receiving communion on the hand without any protest. In another controversy related to the liturgy, Archbishop Bugnini and the CDW successfully lobbied for the suppression of the minor orders which all ancient Christian churches held as antecedents to the clerical state. Traditionally, a Roman Rite man's journey to the priesthood entailed being ordained to the minor orders of porter, acolyte, lector, subdeacon, and then to deacon, finally being ordained a priest. And I forgot exorcist is in there too. The minor order of reader or lector, subdeacon, and acolyte, as well as an additional order of chanter, are still preserved in the Eastern rites and in the Eastern Orthodox churches as well. However, due to a handful of quotes in the writings of the 3rd century anti-pope and then later repentant anti-pope who became a faithful Catholic and died a martyr and a saint, because of the writings of Hippolytus while he was an anti-pope, the concilium and the liturgical movement in general believed that minor orders should be referred to rather as liturgical ministry rather than minor degrees of the sacrament of holy orders. So let's take a close look at how the minor orders were suppressed, because it's a good examination of how Bugnini operated and how the liturgical movement was spinning out of the control of Pope Paul VI. In 1966, after the first suggestion of the elimination of minor orders, the Congregation of Sacraments vehemently opposed this proposal. In April 12th, 1967, the Concilium sent Paul VI a memorandum suggesting that the minor orders were a problem, which required a full immediate resolution. Pope Paul VI responded in his own handwriting right away, saying, "Minor orders should not be abolished, but conferred with improved rights." More formally, on May 4th, he wrote, "Minor orders must be retained, but their concept and functions must be developed." End quote. The Concilium thus continued to investigate the question. The Concilium continued to hold the opinion, however, that the minor orders served no function, and they continued to push for their abolition. In 1968, the Concilium made these views known once again to Pope Paul VI. A statement was sent back to the Concilium from the Vatican Secretariat, saying, "Minor orders should, it seems clear, be retained. They enjoy a degree of antiquity, they help introduce men to the clerical life, they can give spiritual meaning and value to the religious service that laymen perform. It will be necessary to restore the original meaning, amongst other things." In 1969, since the Concilium had been repeatedly denied, I suspect, instigation of members of the Concilium, who did in fact hold episcopal offices throughout the world, and Bugnini had a lot of connections throughout the world. I suspect that when the Concilium's request for the suppression of minor orders was denied repeatedly, they began the seeds of an open rebellion against minor orders. So this rebellion begins in 1969. The Bishop of Rottenburg asked permission to allow, quote, "as a favor, just this once," end quote, a group of permanent deacons to omit minor orders because it made them uncomfortable. Why did that make them uncomfortable? Maybe they shouldn't be deacons if they're uncomfortable with the tradition of the church. This was granted by Pope Paul VI, and although he relented to this favor just this once, Pope Paul VI asked the Concilium, or the Congregation of Divine Worship at this point, to come up, that would have probably still been the Concilium at that point, but regardless, Pope Paul VI asked them to come up with more formal guidelines to respond to such circumstances quickly, since bishops were asking for such requests, and they would always label their requests as being urgent, demanding immediate attention. Pope Paul VI is sort of noticing that this seems to be a weird tactic being used by these bishops, always phrasing their requests to break canon law as urgent. We have to be able to do this. Please grant this request immediately. Requests then flooded the Vatican, according to Bugnini in his book, to omit the minor orders from ordination from the following nations. So once this concession was granted, as a favor, just this once, this spread quickly, and all these other nations began to ask for the exact same permission. The permission to omit minor orders from the rite of ordination came from France, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Canada. According to Bugnini, quote, "Because Rome did not answer or kept delaying, some conferences acted on their own responsibility, undertook their own reform," end quote. So Bugnini's implying that it was really Rome's fault for not responding immediately because it was so urgent. And so these bishops had no choice but to take it upon their own responsibility to suppress minor orders all on their own. As with the international dissent from the bishops' conferences after Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI found that when he attempted to maintain a particular tradition, Bishop conferences would simply openly dissent against him. In 1970, after Pope Paul VI consulted the Congregation of Divine Worship, they wrote, quote, "Minor orders should be reduced to 2, lector and a combination of the acolyte and subdeacon." Meanwhile, in 1970, Bishop Zollner of Austria told the Vatican that a group of seminarians were, quote, "refusing to receive them in the traditional form, claiming that they are absurd and not fulfillable." Where would these seminarians get the idea that the minor orders were absurd and not fulfillable? Probably from their seminary professors. They even constructed their own, the seminarians constructed their own, quote, "new form that they want the consecration bishop to use." I'm sorry if too judgmental, but arrogance of seminarians to construct their own rite of ordination and tell the bishop, "This is how I want you to ordain me." Those seminarians are now the bishops of the church, and they will be for the next 20 years or so. So that's something that we have obedience to the magisterium, or else we are not Catholic. But I'm not saying this particular group of seminarians, but the fact that that attitude was even in the minds of anyone in seminary. I know Capuchins who are of that same generation who just refuse to wear their habits, and a lot of them now wear their habits, but like they just told their formation directors, "We're not wearing habits," and it's just like that was the attitude of the generation of priests that are now ruling the church. So that's the generational context explains why there are perhaps certain issues in the hierarchy today. An identical case arose in Switzerland as the Congregation of Sacraments considered a response, seminarians refusing to be ordained to the minor orders. Cardinal Villot then responded that until new rites be drawn up for the Reformed minor orders, all bishops requesting exemptions should be granted them. The minor orders could be skipped entirely by any bishops who wanted to skip them. The Congregation of Divine Worship responded that they could present a reformed rite for the minor orders for the 5 remaining minor orders immediately, which they provided for the minor orders of porter, exorcist, lector, acolyte, and subdeacon. These performed rites replaced the tonsure with a blessing, and even though they said they were going to produce a new rite for the 5 minor orders, their new rite didn't include the phrase minor order anywhere. There was a push, however, by consultors, who were, Bugnini's associates, to omit the term minor order entirely from all references to this ritual, and only use terms for these ministries that, in their opinion, held ministerial functionality. On September 11th, 1970, Pope Paul VI once again urged the retention of the term minor order. In his letter, we read, quote, "His Holiness asks whether this might not be more appropriately handled separately." So he's asking things rather than, which he had the right to rule. I don't think he denied he had the right to rule, but he did prefer to ask. A number of cardinals this entire time, especially after 1970, wrote letters asking for the Congregation of Divine Worship to retain the minor orders. Cardinal Ottaviani was amongst those cardinals who wrote to the Congregation of Divine Worship. It was about 5 cardinals wrote, and they're all recorded here. In November of 1970, the Congregation of Divine Worship promulgated a document which indeed ultimately called for the suppression of the term minor order entirely, citing Hippolytus's insistence that these are ministries, not an ordained office. Hippolytus is the only patristic source that says anything like the fact that these are ministries and not orders, but Hippolytus himself does not contradict the concept of minor orders. He just says you don't ordain people to the office of lector because it's a ministry, but he doesn't say that using the phrase minor order is incorrect. So this is the only patristic evidence we have for any precedent for suppressing the minor orders. Ultimately, on December 3rd, 1972, the CDW promulgated new instructions. The minor orders would be from then on referred to as ministries and were reduced to only 2 ministries, lector and acolyte. The other minor orders were either abolished or simply inferred in rites, which elevated men to the diaconate, the beginning of the clerical state. Today, Pope Francis has instituted a new ministry, the ministry. In other words, after years of debate, Bugnini got exactly what he wanted from the very beginning, as he always did. As the 1970s continued, requests were raised by various bishops' conferences for permission to construct additional youth prayers beyond the 4 which had been included in the Novus Ordo. The concilium was also in favor of expanding the number of Eucharistic prayers in general. Thus, in 1974, the Congregation of Divine Worship requested permission to create 3 new anaphoras for masses with children. They already had, this was the anaphoras that we still have today, and 2 new anaphoras for the Holy Year of Reconciliation. The assumption is then that these anaphoras would only be used during the Holy Year of Reconciliation. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith expressed, quote, its lively concern with the increasing number of Eucharistic prayers due to, quote, the doctrinal confusion presently existing in matters liturgical. The CDF responded that only 1 new Eucharistic prayer should be composed for masses with children and 1 for the Holy Year, respectively. The Concilium attempted to circumvent this decision by appealing directly to the Vatican Secretary of State's office for permission for their original plan, with 1 less prayer requested for masses with children. By the way, that was for everything I talked about with the minor order suppression. This is where that comes from. That is not actually in my book, so that's only in the slideshow, so I included the citation here. St. Paul VI was also hesitant to grant the CDW's request, as he held the same reservations as those raised by the CDF. However, after enough insistence on the part of Archbishop Bugnini, the Holy Father ultimately granted permission for the Concilium's request on a 3-year experimental basis. Thus, 3 new anaphoras were written for masses with children, and 2 were written for the Holy Year of Reconciliation. These were titled Eucharistic Prayer 1 for Reconciliation, Eucharistic Prayer 2 for Reconciliation. Immediately after he said, I will allow this but only for 3 years, and well before that experiment was completed, immediately the bishops of the Netherlands and Belgium both requested permission to retain all 5 of these Eucharistic prayers permanently. The Pope asked a joint commission of bishops of the CDW and the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith to consider this request. Though the bishops in large part voted in the negative to this request, after this vote was completed, basically the bishops all said, no, we have a 3-year experiment set up, let's just keep what we said. But then after that was the vote, Archbishop Bugnini personally appealed to the Pope with his own opinion. Pope Paul VI granted Bugnini's request, which was beginning to feel not so much like a request, but like a demand. The final and largely failed thrust of the liturgical movement was the effort to see the liturgy inculturated in each individual bishop's conference. The so-called Hindu Rite Mass in India and the Zaire Rite in the Congo are examples of inculturated usages of the Novus Ordo Missal. Both of these inculturated usages incorporated pre-Christian, pagan religious gestures and native customs into the celebration of the Mass. The Hindu Rite quickly became quite controversial and was subsequently suppressed in 1976, 1 year after Bugnini was relieved of his duties. The Zaire Rite is still in use today. A number of other subtle adaptations of the Novus Ordo were made in nations such as Thailand, Pakistan, Japan, and Laos. The concept of cautiously incorporating certain pagan prayer gestures and rituals into the Mass is of course not necessarily contradictory to Catholic tradition, seeing that certain elements of the Roman liturgy were incorporations of pre-Christian Roman customs. In the early liturgy, Joseph Youngman argued that, quote, the shortness, conciseness, clarity, and austerity of the Roman Rite's liturgical patrimony were inherited from the pre-Christian religious temperament of the Roman people. Additionally, liturgical adornments such as the pipe organ was originally a profane instrument popular in the Greco-Roman world used at parties and dances. What's more, the external form of Roman Catholic devotional processions seems to have descended from the processions of the ancient Roman world as well. The Catholic Ember Days were also an element of pagan piety in Rome. Therefore, while incorporating certain pagan practices into the Catholic devotional treasury, if they are thoroughly baptized and cleansed of all paganism, and it's only the outward gestures that are retained, replaced with, of course, the faithful gospel of Jesus, well, while there is some precedent for doing that in the Church's prayer life, Archbishop Bugnini's interest in preserving Catholic dogma in his efforts to inculturate the liturgy could be questioned, seeing that he considered it to be worthy of real consideration whether or not the Hindu scriptures of the Bhagavad Gita and other texts might be incorporated into the Mass as celebrated in India. Reflecting on the controversy over the so-called Hindu Rite, Archbishop Bugnini wrote that his opinion that theologians ought to have duly considered whether readings from the Hindu scriptures, quote, might not be used in expressing Christian religious thought, end quote, in the liturgy of the Word. But he lamented that the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, quote, had always been intransigent, end quote, when it came to responding to requests that non-biblical readings might be read at the Mass. And so, the the suggestion that Hindu scriptures be read during the liturgy of the Word was not given enough consideration, in Archbishop Bugnini's opinion. The attempt to inculturate the liturgy according to the customs of each individual national bishops' conference was of course cut short ultimately in 1975, when Bugnini fell out of favor with Pope Paul VI. During the final stages of the promulgation of the Novus Ordo and the years that followed it, as we have seen, Paul VI found himself again and again disagreeing with the Concilium and the CDW after that, though his own trust in the consensus of his advisory body of scholars led him to consistently defer to their scholarly authority over his own magisterial judgment. As we have explored, by the mid-1970s, St. Paul VI had relented to Bugnini for the liturgy in a number of circumstances. It seems that by 1975, unlike the enthusiastic promoters of the liturgical reform who sought a reform beyond the reform, Paul VI had seen enough innovation in the liturgy. Since it had become evident that Bugnini and the CDW were still pushing forward to incorporate additional changes to the liturgy beyond the 1969 Missal, and were in fact successfully accomplishing everything they sought to do, even against Paul VI's wishes, Paul VI was faced with the task of determining how he could cut off Bugnini's freight train of reform from continuing on its present course. If he had simply left Bugnini in power, either of the Concilium or of the CDW or of the unofficial arm of the reform, the International Liturgical Press, Bugnini would lead to more and more liturgical revolts because these were in fact more effective at seeing liturgical change than his bureaucracy was in general. If Paul VI were to establish liturgical order in the Church, he could not simply legislate it because there would simply be revolt. He needed to stop the revolts and innovations before they were planned, and he was beginning to perceive that these were being planned with Bugnini himself. He needed then to decapitate the head of the liturgical revolution, Bugnini himself, although he didn't literally decapitate him. By 1975, Bugnini had proven himself more than capable as a bureaucratic organizer at the official level and at the unofficial level at seeing nearly every one of his liturgical wishes promulgated at the universal level. Simply put, Paul VI needed to think of some way to remove Bugnini not only from his position of juridical power, but from his position of influence as well. It was thus without warning that on July 14, 1975, Bugnini was notified that he had been removed from his post in the CDW and had been assigned as an apostolic nuncio in Uruguay. According to Bugnini himself, the Secretary of State, Monsignor Benelli, told him, quote, "You're better off down there, far away. That way we won't see you anymore." Whether or not this awkward interaction actually occurred, it would seem to indicate that Bugnini perceived that he had made a number of key enemies in the Vatican. Whatever his goals were in reassigning Bugnini as a papal diplomat, Paul VI may well have been influenced in his decision by the suggestions of Bugnini's foes. In Liturgy, a more progressive text written by Rita Ferrone, this liturgist recorded the observation that, quote, "The decade following 1975 was a period of stabilization rather than a period of unrest in the liturgical reform." She doesn't seem to realize that this period of stabilization happened only after the father of the liturgical reform was removed from his position. She wrote, she was rather indicating that, see, it might have been a little choppy at first, but eventually the Novus Ordo would settle in and there would be peace. This peace occurred, intentionally. It was because Bugnini was revealed. She wrote that a sense of the sacred was returning to liturgical celebrations, implying that it wasn't there immediately after the Novus Ordo was promulgated, and that the period of, quote, revolution, end quote, had given place to a period in which Catholics could describe themselves as, quote, relaxing at worship. She then goes on to lament the rise of the traditional Latin Mass, throughout the world by traditionalist orders and by Pope John Paul II, kind of pointing to its beauty in the late 80s and 90s. It is evident, of course, that if Archbishop Bugnini had not been dismissed, this period of liturgical revolution would have continued, perhaps, for decades. Necessary though it was, St. Paul VI treaded difficult waters in settling the question of how to dismiss Archbishop Bugnini from his secretariat. If Bugnini was disgraced in too explicit a fashion, the credibility of St. Paul VI's own missal reform would have certainly been called into question. However, Bugnini could not merely be kicked upstairs to another academic post, since this would have continued to allow him to have his position of influence over the global liturgical movement and revolution. By being assigned as an apostolic nuncio first to Uruguay in 1975, he would be removed quite some distance from Vatican politics, and would be very unable to coordinate international revolutions without his connections in Rome. This is, of course, before the internet. Bugnini, however, refused to accept the position in Uruguay since he did not know how to speak Spanish. He would then be reassigned to be an apostolic nuncio to Iran, which is perhaps a more difficult position, but he did know French, and that was a well-spoken language in Iran, and so he had no ability really to refuse. Thus, by 1976, Annibale Bugnini was effectively isolated from the global liturgical movement, which Pope Paul VI intended to begin to slow down, and that slowing down of the revolutionary fervor of progressive Catholicism would only continue under the reign of Pope John Paul II. Quite possible that St. Paul VI's growing trust in Karol Wojtyla was perhaps the reason that he began to move in this direction in the late 1970s. If you want to read more about how Karol Wojtyla rose in Pope Paul VI's confidence throughout the 1970s, and even the 60s before that, I have some information on that here. Now, was Bugnini banished because it was discovered that he was a Freemason? Great question. However, we're going to have to discuss that in a short video that I will go ahead and publish tomorrow, because we are at the 1 hour mark, and I like to keep things there. So we'll talk all about whether or not Bugnini was a Freemason in the next video. It'll be very quick. It'll be published tomorrow. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittivis debitoribus nostris. Et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, may the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your mind anything I've said unfaithful to him or untrue. Thank you so much for watching this video to its conclusion. God bless you. See you next time. Bye.